Far east of the Sword Coast, the Shadowvar and Discoverin have fallen. The Shadow Storm is no more. Sembia is fractured into city-states. A mysterious hero rises from the ashes to usher in a new era of prosperity. Yet there is still suffering. Cormyr and the wild elves of the Dalelands offer war on all sides. Earth motes, madness, and shadow dragons plague the lands. These are the tales of the heroes who ended that suffering. 1491 DR, the year of Sembian revival.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Long-Winded One. With me tonight, I have my friends Max and Chris, who play the characters of Mitoa and Ciran, respectively. So welcome, you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, Jared. It's great to be here.
Well, if you didn't get enough of me throughout the week, playing in 2 campaigns and doing some of these voice acting recording sessions, well, here's one more that I'm adding to your weekly D&D responsibilities, which I'm sure you hate terribly.
I think your listeners are probably very similar to us in that D&D and its ability to transfer so seamlessly to an online gaming platform has really saved me in more ways than one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's for all aspects of my life. When I've had major life changes, like if I've moved away from friends or family, or had really stressful times in my life, like the last year, right, the pandemic. Seeing you guys every week and getting to be transported into this fantasy world has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I never thought I would be a 2 campaigns a week sort of person, but boy, it's been wonderful this last year.
Yeah, for sure. And for the listeners, Max is now actually DMing a campaign in Greyhawk for us. We've been doing that for over a year. And I have started up part 2 of this, which is in Cormyr, which may or may not make it into podcast format in the future, depending on how this one goes. But let's we could probably sit here and chat for a long time, but I want to the purpose of these are for the listeners to get to know the people behind the characters. And so if I could start with the first question, it is, tell us a little bit about your background playing D&D and role-playing games. And let's just alphabetically, we'll start with Chris.
Okay. I don't have a long history with it, but I do have a history that started when I think, like many folks, in elementary school and middle school. And I started because my friend Mark, boy, I have not said that name in so long. My friend Mark's older brother was a D&D guy, and he offered to show us how to play. But we were really into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and there's a TMNT version, right, of a role playing game, and we gravitated towards that. And most of the time, we just made characters. We loved making characters and giving them backstories. And then when it came to actually playing the game, we were like, that was secondary,
Yeah.
And then I didn't play at a table until I moved up here into the Berkshires of Massachusetts and met Max, and invited him while I was working with some young folks in our community to help DM a D&D game. And that is what hooked me and brought me back in, was Max.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason that I invited you guys together, not just proximity, but obviously, in real life and in the game, your characters are so closely joined. So Max, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, D&D for me was not a word in my repertoire until college. The only time I had heard it was horror stories from my grandmother telling me about people who killed each other with swords in the sewers in the 70s, right? But my friends and I would always, we just called them imaginary games, but we would make characters and go on D&D style adventures together in the woods. And so I got to college and I had a friend named Alex who tried for months to get me to play, and I was just not into it. And one night he finally convinced me to play, and I swear it changed my life. I started playing once a week through school, and just being able to turn off my brain and laugh hysterically for hours at a time. Yeah, and it's been part of my life ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're an excellent DM, and you've taught me a lot about DMing. More than anything, I think you've taught me to be flexible, and you kind of have to be flexible with our group. But let's drill in a little bit. So you've talked a little bit about the sort of your prehistory with role playing games, but what about like Forgotten Realms and Symbia? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I would totally defer to you, Max.
Actually, Forgotten Realms for me goes back a really long ways. When I was in probably 5th or 6th grade, somebody gave me the first book from R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt Do'Urden books. And they gave me the full anthology of the first trilogy, and I ended up reading most of that sequence of books and completely fell in love with Icewind Dale and the Sword Coast. But had no idea it was part of this D&D universe until much, much later. So once I discovered D&D, it was this wonderful connection to something that had been immensely meaningful for me growing up.
Well, it's what you mentioned about some of these novels, and if you think to like some of the video games we've played, and like the world is so vast, especially along the Sword Coast. One of the reasons that I picked Symbia as a this sounds silly now, knowing the book series that I'm focused on is called Symbia, A Gateway to the Realms. But the reason I picked Symbia was because there was very little written or known about Symbia, and it was a gateway. It was like where is a place that I can enter the world without having to worry about all of this, like books and video games of all of this stuff that I should know, but I don't. Right. And so for me, Symbia was that gateway. What about you, Chris? What's your experience with Forgotten Realms and Symbia?
None.
No. Symbia was it?
Seriously, you want to know my honest approach to this is I honestly, and I'm so sorry to purists out there, but I don't know the difference between Symbia, Cormyr, Greyhawk. I honest to God, I am just clueless about that stuff, and I don't know what's different about them. My approach to the gameplay is just to commit fully to the reality of the character that I'm playing, and to respond to what's happening. And you guys are you're so well versed in the worlds as DMs that you hold that for me when I play. Like I never feel like I don't belong at the table, that my character play is what allows me to be there. And so, yeah, I don't know anything about them.
I think that's one of the really nice things about tabletop role-playing games, though, is that it can really support a huge variety of players. You all actually met my friend Alex when he came and guest DM'd, and he is somebody
he's so good.
He is someone who goes to lore levels like beyond even what Jared does. Like he'll make up a world and he'll write the history and figure out the languages and the magic systems. And then on the other hand, there's people like you and I, Chris, who don't necessarily go that deep. I don't even go that deep with Greyhawk. It's for me, it's about setting the players up in a world where they can live. And one of the reasons I like using worlds like Greyhawk that are pre-made and really fleshed out is that the players can choose how deep they want to go into that world and what their characters are going to navigate through the campaign.
Yeah, and my approach is like my character, because we love to start at first level characters, is like my character wouldn't know anything outside of their village. Like it just wouldn't matter. And so when these creatures or things pop up, like it is genuine surprise and shock and fear that comes out in my voice, because this is the first time I'm ever encountering a monster like this, or a big bad like this. So yeah, all of it is real, because I think that's what would happen, for a halfling who's growing up in this tiny town, or a half elf who spent his whole life just really as a ranger between a couple of villages, right? Like the whole world was, no more than a 40-mile radius to him.
Yeah. Well, let's drill into your characters, because you, as you mentioned, you drill so much into the character's personality, and sort of, Chris goes so far as to stay using that character's voice for the entire session. So let's talk about your process for your character creation for both Ciran and Mitoa. And we've started with Chris a couple times. Let's start with Max this time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I have to be totally honest with you. When Chris invited me to come play in the Sembia campaign, I just wanted to play a bard. I knew I wanted to play a bard, and I love Kenkus. And so Mitoa began as just out of a desire for me to play a Kenku bard, because I thought it was a hilarious combination. That worked really well. But then once we landed in the world of Sembia, he started to take on a much different life, and it's interesting that you're thinking about sort of what you were saying about your character, Chris, sort of not necessarily having experienced the world, and I think that's exactly what I had to come to with Mitoa, because at the beginning of the campaign, at least in the played version, he was essentially just a street urchin who loved to collect stories. It all came from this love of collecting stories, and it just grew from there. One of the things I love about the Sembia campaign, though, is the way the world molded our characters, and I really felt like all of the characters in the campaign had true character development, which I don't always find in D&D campaigns.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, for our podcast, Mitoa is a crucial, I mean, however he started, he's the character that the plot sort of revolves around, right? And you might talk about this a little bit later, but originally Mitoa didn't start off as a harper. He became a harper. And that's a change that we made in the podcast, but for the purposes of the podcast, we're essentially, in fact, I think even Ciran said it in one of the last episodes in Culta. I'm just following you now, Mitoa, and we're all kind of just following Mitoa,
Yeah, I think the change to making him a harper in the podcast was a good choice, because it grounds his story and it gives him some more reason to be striving as hard as he does to find the things that he wants to find.
Yeah. What about you, Chris? What made you want to play Ciran?
Well, honestly, I thought the picture in the book of a half elf was like super awesome. So I was like, I want to be whatever that is. And in the original conception of this character, like it had all of this, half elves are usually emissaries or diplomats, and I was like, I don't know about that. Maybe he is, but in a different way, as a person of the earth and as a ranger. Like he is a sort of an emissary with I guess lowborn folk. Is that how they refer to them? And I don't know.
Yeah, the merchant class.
The merchant class, right? And so that was the idea. And the thing that really, I wanted to play was like somebody in search of community, which resonates with me, is somebody who's really values community and belonging and what that means, and to have a character who starts out feeling like he doesn't belong, and how does he craft a world for himself. I was really interested in exploring that and finding out how Ciran developed that. And I didn't find out till later, apparently people think rangers are dumb, and like, that's just not how I don't play according to like how to make it like the coolest buffs or the strongest this or that. And I don't know enough about items to like pre-plan how I'm going to make them this monster. I just really love the idea of somebody who spent time in the woods and cared about the people in the villages that he visited.
Yeah. Well, that's something that hasn't changed from your initial character creation. Ciran is much more than sometimes how he portrays himself, and there have been a few scenes in the podcast that's become really clear. So if we can, let's go there now and talk about. The question was to you: how do your characters differ from the ones in the podcast, if at all?
Oh yeah. I think, one of the biggest changes, and I think it's important for a real story like a podcast, is that Mitoa's motivations, I think, are a lot firmer. In the campaign, a lot of it was he was a collector of stories and was seeking out the best story. Right? Like, this is a story that he realized was going to go down in the ages, and he was going to be the one to collect it and set it into history. Whereas in the podcast, he has a mission. He's got these alliances from the beginning that I think allow that sort of, kooky, charismatic bard to have more of a reason to, as I said a few minutes ago, more of a reason to do what he does as he moves through the world in Sembia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tried to take your collector of stories idea and translate that into the person in the group who often is the scholar, right? Who knows about the mythology of something, who knows about the nuances of the languages or the history of something. And this comes out here recently in the Tomb of Ravenna, where Mitoa is explaining how to read these pictorial, these horizontal pictorial images, and how they tell a story. So hopefully that came out. I haven't totally butchered your character creation.
No. It definitely comes through. And I think in the campaign, one of the reasons Mitoa ended up being the one everybody was sort of following was because I had the best charisma, and so every time we got into something, we needed the Kenku to talk us out of it, right? But he found that it was always kind of funny to me because he was the one who didn't have the strongest motivations in the group.
Yeah. What about you, Chris?
I would say the biggest difference is that, when we started out our story, Ciran didn't really know any of these folks and didn't have a history with any of them. Mm-hmm. And so the difference for me has been starting the story when these relationships are already established, which I think is, of course, like, it's a different way of storytelling. And I really appreciate, like sort of jumping in a little bit further forward, because you can always go back and explore things earlier. But yeah, I think that's the biggest difference for me is like, Ciran already has these relationships, so he doesn't have to sort of work them out and learn to trust. He already has it starting out.
Yeah. And what's funny is, again, I keep coming back to the last episode that we have done, that we have produced. And that's at this point, it's the mausoleum with Ravenna. And, there's a point where Jindal and Sonya are talking, and it's clear that Sonya really knows Ciran and is like, look, I know you guys don't get along, sometimes, but there's a lot more to Ciran than meets the eye. And hopefully that comes out.
Yeah. I mean, so as a professional storyteller myself, like I value conflict in story. So that is a place I'm really comfortable going as a improviser, role player person, is introducing conflict. And, groups just aren't immediately cohesive and friendly all the time. And there are rivalries, and there's like ways, they go through hardships and they get stronger. They don't trust them. And I think I really enjoy that, bringing that aspect to the way I play my games.
Yeah. And without giving anything away, Ciran is an incredibly deep character that, ogres are like onions, right? Like, I just feel like Ciran's like that. You keep pulling back layers and there's just more to discover.
Yeah. And I got so into it, like I'm not giving anything away, things go poorly, things go well, but there were times when we played that game when stuff would happen, I would be a wreck for like a day and a half. And I couldn't figure out why I was so bummed. And then I'd realize like, oh, I'm carrying this tragedy with me. That is really only exists in my gameplay world, but I was like holding it.
So the thing that really stands out for me was when he dropped the orb and Jario crashed down, and for the first time you see the depth of his character and how much he pretends to not be bothered by some of these things, but like he couldn't shake that, you know.
And I don't remember if in the podcast, but in the campaign, I think Ciran's father was there, right? Or am I misremembering that?
No,
he was in. What are we calling it now? Jarliel.
Jarliel, yeah.
That's right.
All right. Well, just for the sake of time here, I'm going to go to the next question here.
Yep.
And this is a question about so far what's been in the podcast. Like, are there any story points, plot points, story arcs that you're really happy made it into the podcast so far from the campaign, or is there anything coming up that you really hope is in there without giving too much away?
Oh, I've got my answer for this. I love the fact that you've introduced some complexity about the relationship between Aldond and his sword. And that's something we didn't get, I think, till much later in the played version. And I love that you're setting that up early on.
Nice. Yeah. So I tried to, it's when I was wrestling with how I was going to tell the story, I went through, Chris will tell you, I went through several different ideas. And when I finally settled on this one, I discovered accidentally that the bad guys needed a voice about every 10 episodes. And I think that that's been really great. They're harder to write because I don't know the characters as well, because I write for these other characters all the time now. I think it was necessary to tell a well-rounded story, to tell their points of view.
Yeah. I'd say the thing that really sticks out for me that I'm really glad is in the story is something that I really enjoy about this world is like the complexity of the theology of that there are different levels of different types of gods working at cross purposes. I just really love like the layers of power struggles that are happening and how these players, continually to find themselves into different layers of these larger cosmic struggles.
Well, that actually is a great segue into my next question, and that is about the villains. And this is the last question I'll have for you tonight. So the question is about scariest villains. So we have Thera, we have Aldond, if you can call him a villain, and we have, of course, the sword now, which is a part of that, and we have the Shatterkai, the Caligaxes who are chasing everybody. Or maybe there's something else out there that I haven't mentioned. What for you? What is the scariest villain?
The scariest villain for me. It's the Shadowkai who just kind of like show up and are really scary. Because I never know, and this was my experience in the game, I never know how powerful they are, who's going to show up with them, and whether or not like this one is like a mega general. I was always afraid to interact with those characters because I never knew if they were going to like, hit me for 1,000,000 points. And I was like, well, I guess Ciran's story is over.
There were a few of those moments, I think. We've tried to paint Caligax as there's been several Shutterkais that have showed up who are unnamed, but there have been a few times where the source has actually told Sonya, like, run, like, get out of here, because if he catches you, you're not going to escape. And so we've kind of molded Caligax into that sort of quintessential bad guy Shutterkai.
Yeah, those types of things scare me.
What about you, Max?
Yeah, I mean, for me, my favorite villain in the whole campaign was always Thera. I love every time we encountered Thera, she's just there to mess stuff up for the whole party. And she's got schemes and she's got allies. And I always enjoyed coming up against Thera.
Yeah, well, she's gone through a lot of changes too. And I got to say, Evelyn plays her so scary, like
so well.
Yeah,
Mm.
the voice she uses and her attitude when it comes to it, and she gets. I just wrote a script for episode 16, and the bad guys sort of get another chance to tell their story, and yeah, she's even more terrifying in this one. So Well, anyway, anything to leave us with here before I go for the evening? I told you I'd keep you for 30 minutes, and here we are. Anything else for the good of the order?
Yeah, Jared, thank you so much. I mean, the campaign was a pleasure to play in, and it's a pleasure to relive the story again in podcast form, and I hope the audience is enjoying it.
All right. Well, thank you guys for bringing your talents, and I'll see you in a few minutes for our next campaign. Though this marks the end of the episode, the tale continues within a 10-day. Join us at longwinded.one and consider giving us a review on Apple Music, Spotify, or really whichever platform you choose.